You ever get a game purely on a friend's recommendation without knowing anything about it, then join a private multiplayer game with exclusively RPGs flying in every direction and the entire map is engulfed in flames, and then when you go to heal, your character jams his finger into a pulsating bullet wound and pushes the shell out through the other side? Well, that's how I was first introduced to the Far Cry franchise, and whoa was my middle school mind blown. Far Cry 2 came out in 2008, and I was immediately enamored with the game. However, what really drew me into Far Cry 2 was how realistic and gritty the game felt at the time. The healing mechanic itself was a gory glory to behold as a 13-year-old. But the campaign really sucked me in with its tale of a mercenary inflicted with malaria hunting down an arms dealer in a war-torn African nation. I had never played a game like that, so when Far Cry 3 came out, you already know I bought that thing right away, only for that game to be even better than the second one, but in completely fresh and unique ways that felt like a natural advancement to the series. In this video, I want to talk about Far Cry 1, 2, and 3, and discuss the evolution of the series from a babes and bullets sci-fi shooter to a free-roam trek through madness invoking the tragedy of Apocalypse Now. I'm going to be looking at the gameplay as well as level design and worlds, and I'm going to wrap up by talking about the plot, characters, and themes of each of these games, which will present the picture of a franchise that continued to exceed expectations with each new entry. This is the evolution of the Far Cry franchise. I'm not going to be pulling any spoiler punches in this video. The most recent game I'm going to be discussing is from 9 years ago, so just know what you're in for here. But to kick things off, I want to begin with the evolution of the gameplay mechanics, focusing largely on three main areas: combat, traversal, and stealth. Far Cry as a franchise has never veered from the first-person shooter style of combat, at least not in its main gameplay mechanics, and I think that's a major benefit to the games. It helps aid in the immersion and really puts the player in the shoes of the main character. The games always center around some sort of gunplay combat, giving the player an increasingly large arsenal of weapons as the game progresses. In all three of these entries, the game offers a large variety of different types of weapons to keep things feeling varied and dynamic, offering the player the ability to enter into any combat situation differently depending on what weapons they have equipped at the time. For example, by the end of Far Cry 3, I was running around with a weapon for every occasion and enemy type: a silent sniper, an assault rifle, a silenced pistol, and an RPG. The weapon systems doesn't actually vary that much between entries. The biggest difference between all three is in Far Cry 2 with the introduction of a gun quality mechanic. This led to guns jamming after being used too frequently and encouraged players to switch or refresh guns often to keep this from occurring. Personally, I think it was a bit too much. I liked it, but it happened maybe twice as often as it should have. People presumably agreed with me since this mechanic was removed from the franchise alongside the malaria. I will say though, that by the time of Far Cry 3, the game developers really got a nice feel down for how the weapons fire. It just felt a lot better to shoot a pistol in Far Cry 3 than in the previous games. The real difference in the combat between the games comes in the more minute mechanics, like being able to mark an enemy's position as well as the healing mechanics. All three of these games give the player some ability to scout out enemies, either through a pair of binoculars, some singular scope thing, or through a camera lens. But only Far Cry 1 and 3 kept the scouted out enemies highlighted on your screen after the scouting is done. Far Cry 2 goes with a much more realistic approach of not having magical floating arrows above people's heads. However, there must have been some internal conversations after the release of 2, which brought the markers back for 3 and all the following games in the series. On the flip side, something that Far Cry 2 took to the next level over 1 was the new healing mechanic. In Far Cry 1, the player was dependent upon health packs littered randomly throughout the map, and trust me, if you didn't have one near you, you had to play it extremely safe until you could find one. As alluded to earlier, Far Cry 2 introduced the field healing mechanic, where in a beautiful act of desperation, the character did something gruesome in order to heal himself. This didn't fully heal the character, but at least brought back a base level of health while health packs were still present in the world in the form of syringes. Far Cry 3 expanded on this mechanic by having unlockable skills where the field healing would repair more health the further you leveled it up, getting to the point of a potential full self-heal without the need for any syringes. Speaking of leveling up, Far Cry 3 took a big step to separate it from the previous two games by introducing a skill tree which can level up 3 different aspects of the gameplay. Far Cry 1 had nothing like this, and Far Cry 2 attempted to have some player progression, but this largely came from unlocking new weapons by doing certain side missions and buying better equipment with in-game currency earned by doing missions. Personally, I really like the addition of XP and a skill tree in Far Cry 3. It isn't that big, and the different takedown abilities make it worthwhile. Some things on the skill tree are kind of dumb, but the brilliant implementation of the skill tree came with the main character's arm tattoo, or tatau if you're nasty, and each new unlocked skill added to the tattoo, which has significance to the main plot, but also just looked really cool. It took the player's experience and literally presented it on their sleeve in a fun but subtle way that was tied into the plot and character motivation. Next up is the in-game traversal systems. This remained surprisingly consistent throughout the majority of these 3 games. If you're familiar with the franchise, you'll know that Far Cry 3 introduced a wingsuit toward the back half of the game, but up to that point, the key ways you got around in these games were walking, driving cars or boats, and hang gliding. Yes, hang gliders were a feature even back in Far Cry 1, so the introduction of the wingsuit in Far Cry 3, which again completely changed the franchise, felt like the natural evolution of a gliding mechanic that the franchise started with, just pumped up to the next level. The only real advancement in traversal between Far Cry 1 and 2 is that in 2, you get a repair tool that can fix slightly damaged vehicles. That tool then carries over into Far Cry 3, but it has to be an equipped weapon in your holster, and honestly, it isn't worth it, especially not after the wingsuit is introduced. Which, if I may say, is so sweet. It's one of the most inspired mechanics added to a franchise, and they had the guts to keep it on the back burner until the end of the game in order to keep things feeling fresh and fine when other games may begin to feel a little stagnant. One last thing with traversal, Far Cry 3 just allows the player to control his overall movements better than the clunkier earlier games. It allowed for some light parkour traversal that was utilized to climb some of the radio towers and for some campaign missions. It wasn't anything major, but it just gave an added level of vertical movement to the game. Finally, the stealth mechanics, or the lack thereof. Far Cry 3 kind of was a big deal when it came to implementing fun stealth situations, and it certainly has influenced not only the rest of the franchise going forward, as it has already become cliche to say in this video, but the industry at large to some extent. So to the uninitiated, it may seem odd that there aren't any dedicated stealth systems in the first 2 games of the franchise. That's not to say you couldn't be a little sneaky boy in Far Cry 1 or 2, you certainly could crouch around and do your best to try and get past guards or get yourself into a better position before unleashing a storm of bullets and grenades. Far Cry 2 even introduced silenced weapons you can unlock, which meant you could actually do some stealthy kills. However, that wasn't an option until late in the game, much like the wingsuit in Far Cry 3. So the vast majority of 1 and 2 are spent guns blazing, taking cover, and massacring swaths of mercenaries and mutants in a desperate bid to stay alive. Far Cry 3 added the ability to use takedowns to silently kill enemies, and a large part of the skill tree in that game is actually dedicated to developing your stealth skills by unlocking new takedown abilities, from something simple like moving a dead body, to something more insanely complicated like using your victim's pistol to open fire on his unsuspecting friends, which is probably the least stealthy option out there. Far Cry 3 actually got so deep into the franchise's newfound love of stealth gameplay that it felt the need to try something new in the back half of the game. The player is given the uniform of the mercenary soldiers you're up against so that you can blend into the crowd and move about freely in restricted areas. This was more so done for campaign missions than open world outposts, but still, this slight change in how the player is perceived by the enemy AI once again helped to shake up the gameplay, much like the wingsuit, and kept things feeling fresh in the later parts of the game. Also, Far Cry 3 utilized the silenced weapons introduced in Far Cry 2 by having a silencer be a customizable option for a handful of weapons, including pistols and snipers, as well as adding a bow and arrow for silenced kills with limited ammo fairly early on in the game. Throughout all the gameplay elements, there was one consistent theme, and that is that each game in the Far Cry series built on what came before in a way that enhanced the gameplay and player experience. It even smartly knew which of its advancements were mistakes, like with the enemy markers not remaining on the enemies in Far Cry 2, and was competent enough to add a revamped version of the earlier system into the next game. The gameplay mechanics demonstrate perhaps the most clear through line of consecutive evolution between the first 3 entries in the series, but it is not the only prominent example. Next up, I'm going to be discussing the settings of these 3 game worlds. Far Cry 1 begins on a series of desolate tropical islands that the main character is stranded on. Far Cry 3 also takes place on 2 large desolate tropical islands that the main character is stranded on, whereas Far Cry 2 takes place in a small, war-torn country in Central Africa. In a way, the back and forth of these setting switches actually operates as an evolution itself. I'm going to get more into this in the following section on the story, but Far Cry 2 was a big step up from Far Cry 1 and a more mature game all around. By taking the franchise out of the lush jungles and secret mutant laboratories of Far Cry 1, and instead placing the character in the arid desert landscapes, lush waterways, and dilapidated and underdeveloped settlements of Far Cry 2, the game immediately has a grimmer and more serious atmosphere than established in Far Cry 1. It is in Far Cry 2 that the developers use the setting to craft a more realistic and grittier world. Here, they could add guard outposts that you would have to avoid or be hunted down. They could add no fire zones where a tension of tentative peace is felt. The dry landscape made the destructibility of its setting feel more threatening and natural when massive fires could spread through the foliage. And added to all that, Far Cry 2 takes place in an open world that is split into 2 different maps. Whereas Far Cry 1 is more of a strict narrative structure with the game broken down into levels the player has to work through to keep moving. In that way, the setting of Far Cry 2 advances what was laid out in Far Cry 1 by establishing a starkly different setting, placing the player in an explorable open world, and building mechanics for that open world that fit the atmosphere established by the setting and story. Far Cry 3 builds very much on Far Cry 2's open world while bringing the setting back nearly to the same landscape as Far Cry 1. It is very interesting seeing the similarities between both Far Cry 1 and 3, and the location is perhaps the most obvious. However, Far Cry 3 has an open world that is even more dense and alive than Far Cry 2's. Far Cry 3 is filled to the brim with what most people expect from an open world game today: radio towers to unlock the map, guard outposts to take down, and dozens of hidden collectibles scattered throughout. The game also features wildlife reserved for certain territories of the map, which can be hunted for crafting materials, cities and towns populated with NPCs, and a vibrant environment that feels both lived in and active. This is in stark contrast to the largely dead or dying world of Far Cry 2, while expanding on the open world established in that game. The setting of Far Cry 3 not only is a natural evolution of the prior 2 games, but it combines the best elements from both into something fresh and invigorating for the franchise, while also feeling necessary for the story. Far Cry 3 would not have worked if it was set elsewhere, and I think the setting of the Far Cry games are underrated features of the overall franchise because the story is very much in a symbiotic relationship with the setting. They are so intertwined that it becomes impossible to talk about one without the other. With that said, let's move on to the stories for these 3 games and how they evolved and matured with each entry. So the stories for these 3 games have a pretty insane progression. Once again, I find myself saying that Far Cry 1 and 2 have an extremely stark contrast. I'm not sure what happened in between these 2 games, but it's like night and day at points. The story for Far Cry 1 may be just about as stupid as they come. It's about an ex-military dude who ends up stranded on an island where an insane doctor is creating mutant ape-like creatures, and you're partnered up with a babe who turns out to actually be in the CIA. It's so insane and cheesy with such a goofball charm to it that you can't help but smile, especially at the line delivery for the main character.
How do I know I can trust you?
Hard cut to war-torn Africa, where the main focus is about an arms dealer trying to smuggle refugees out of the country before all hell breaks loose with rival factions in a civil war. Like, Jesus Christ. I don't understand how they made that decision to jump to this kind of story, but I absolutely respect the hell out of the team, and I think both still fall under the Far Cry banner. I don't think either feels out of place. Then, Far Cry 3 turns things up a notch, again seeming to blend the best aspects of the 2 prior games. Far Cry 3 manages to balance the fun bro energy of the first game with its college student main character and his spring break friends, but also maintain the seriousness of Far Cry 2 by having a plot focusing on becoming a killer and a descent into madness if allowed to run wild. But let me go through each story in particular and then show you how the next one builds upon the prior. On this list, Far Cry 1 is actually the only story I can't think of any particular inspiration for, at least not one that is also directly referenced within the game. So in a way, this is Far Cry's most original story of the trilogy, and I do give it points for originality, even if that originality seems like a 12-year-old boy's idea of a cool guy adventure. You play as Jack Carver, an ex-Special Ops beefy bro who is fired upon while escorting who he thinks to be just a babe journalist out to these islands for some assignment. You get separated from Val and end up washed up on shore where you have to fight off some mercenaries. At one point, this dude named Doyle, who I think is also a doctor, calls you and guides you around the different islands to help you find Val. He tells you all about Dr. Krieger, the CEO of Krieger Corp, and the genetic experimentation going on at these islands. Some mutated ape things called Trigens escape during your adventure, and Jack eventually rescues Val, where she reveals she's part of the CIA, and Doyle was their man on the inside she was coming to contact. They find out that Krieger has a nuke on the island and is going to detonate it to cover up all the evidence of his experiments on the islands. So Jack and Val go to steal it, but so that they don't get infected with the mutagen, which can now spread to humans, Doyle tells them to take an antidote, and then they're off. They blow up the nuke and get knocked out and are kidnapped by a peeved off Krieger, but Jack falls out of the helicopter and has to fight his way to Krieger's lab and rescue Val again. When he fights his way there, he finds that Krieger has taken the mutagen and now he is way hotter than ever before. Jack kills him, but it's revealed that, Doyle's a bad nerd, and he tricked Jack and Val both into drinking the mutagen thing to turn them into Trigens, and now he's going to sell the formula on the black market. So Jack goes over there and kills him, then sails off with Val in a boat, and he's cured. Pretty freaking wacky, but fun. Before getting into the specifics, I do think Far Cry 2 suffers a little bit in its implementation of its story for a couple of reasons. I actually think the primary one is the new use of the open world. The game struggles to keep core story beats and concepts at the forefront of the player's mind, since a good deal of this game is spent on the journey between receiving mission assignments and completing them. Also, often your buddy will call you after receiving a mission and offer you a separate path to complete the mission differently, which is an underrated concept that the series veered away from, but also one that helps to muddy the waters of what exactly the beat for beat of this plot is. With that being said, I also think that this game made the active choice to tackle a bit heavier subject matter in a setting that is vastly more complicated than an island ruled by a mad scientist. Not only are there two key warring factions which the player works for, but there are third-party agents trying to manipulate the rule of this war-torn nation from behind the scenes, an underground resistance that aids refugees, your own band of mercenary companions, as well as the arms dealer who is providing both sides with weapons and who is the ultimate goal of the game from the beginning. I respect the hell out of Far Cry 2 for this attempt to take on so much, and I don't think they bit off more than they could chew. I just think this is the type of plot you get with the kind of morally gray, real-world tragedy of war story that they are going for. Essentially, the player arrives in this unnamed country with a mission of hunting down the Jackal, an arms dealer. The player passes out from malaria, which is going to be a reoccurring problem throughout the game, where you'll need to occasionally do missions to make sure you have enough medicine when the need arises. The player catches a brief glimpse of the Jackal spouting out some of his philosophy, and then you're in the middle of a ceasefire zone that erupts. You're saved by a lieutenant for one of the factions, and from here you're essentially just doing missions back and forth between both factions until the entire area becomes destabilized. You do a lot of missions for both factions, occasionally catch a glimpse of the Jackal, and even assassinate new leadership from time to time as the game progresses to a new section of the map. Then, in the final missions, the player finds out that the Jackal's goal is to get all the civilians out of the war-torn country and let the warlords and soldiers all wipe each other out. You kill both the new faction leaders, kill your mercenary friends who are trying to stop you, and either choose to detonate dynamite to keep soldiers from following the refugees out of the country, or agree to bring a case of diamonds to the border guards to let the refugees walk through, and then kill yourself. Your malaria has gotten so bad at this point, you're a dead man walking, and either way, the Jackal is going to do the opposite, and also die in the process. You both accomplish your mission, the refugees go free, the country descends into all-out war, and the game ends. A pretty bittersweet conclusion to a game balancing a lot of complicated topics while still trying to give the player an enjoyable experience. This isn't the best story in the franchise, but it's one that I find myself thinking about a lot. Okay, here it is. The Piece de Resistance. Far Cry 3, The Story of Jason Brody. I'm gonna be honest, before I started this game up again, I had completely forgotten how fun this goddamn story is. It is the ultimate power fantasy, and it's so satisfying to progress through, but with an underlying darkness which keeps the game from outright committing to saying, "Ah yes, Jason rules!" The story felt very well crafted. It really is a character study while focusing on power corrupting the soul, violence changing your character, and an ever-advancing sensation of losing oneself and succumbing to madness. I really like this story a lot. Sorry, on to the details. We begin with shots of these college kids on some kind of crazy vacation, then transition to it being a video we're being shown while locked up in a cage by this insane pirate leader named Voss. Jason is in the cage with his older brother, and the rest of their friends have been captured and are being held elsewhere. The two brothers break out, thanks to the older brother's military training, but the older brother is killed in the escape and Jason flees. He is discovered by Dennis, me, who is part of the Rakyat, a group of warriors native to the island who are under the pirates' rule. Dennis begins to help Jason learn how to become a warrior to save his friends, where he also gets this awesome tattoo. So Jason starts rescuing his peeps and keeps them with this high-as-hell doctor at his house. Eventually, he meets the Rakyat leader, who is this scantily clad young woman named Citra. She sees something in Jason, and after Jason proves himself to her, he is initiated into the Rakyat. Blah blah, Jason does a bunch of other missions trying to find his friends. He runs into an undercover CIA operative who is such a great presence in the game. He also runs into some weird slave owner guy who tries to rape you and your friend. Overall, horrible presence in this game. And along the way, Voss keeps coming up. We also learn that he is Citra's brother. He becomes Jason's sworn enemy. There is something that connects them, and their battle lasts throughout the game, building up a resentment on both sides, while Voss goes out of his way to torture Jason with his own brand of sadistic, prideful madness. Eventually, Jason is able to save his girlfriend Liz after another encounter with Voss, and with Liz's character, Jason's actions are increasingly shown as out of control. She serves as a disapproving moral compass on the occasional stop back at the house. During Jason's quest to save his friends and help the Rakyat free the island, he has become increasingly distant from his friends and seems to be relishing in the violence, adventure, and adrenaline-fueled madness and praise from the Rakyat. His soul seems to be at the edge of darkening forever, becoming someone not too different from Voss. Alright, rushing through the rest of the game, eventually there's a showdown between Jason and Voss, where Jason kills Voss, and then tells his friends that he's going to stay on the island with the Rakyat and free the neighboring island from Voss's boss, Hoyt. Jason goes undercover on the island, sneaking in using his new wingsuit, and disguising himself as one of Hoyt's mercenaries, where he begins working to weaken the organization from the inside. Jason discovers that his younger brother is actually alive. He kills Hoyt and frees his brother, only to find that his friends did not leave the island but are being held hostage by the Rakyat. Citra tells Jason that she loves him and that she wants him to stay and be the warrior of legend. The player gets to make the final choice: kill your friends and stay with Citra, or free your friends and leave the island. Personally, I like the ending where you don't slaughter your innocent girlfriend, instead of slitting her throat and impregnating a crazy island lady who then stabs you in the chest. But that's just me. To each their own. But what are all these games trying to say? Is there a broader message, or is it just fun times, shoot 'em up merry-go-round? Well, the special thing about this franchise is that I think it starts out as just a really simple, cliché action story with no real message other than don't create evil mutants. Then, Far Cry 2 comes out swinging with a story about the tragedy of war that is clearly somewhat inspired by the Heart of Darkness, which is made explicitly clear by using that title as the name of the final location within the game, and the name of the achievement for beating the game. For those who don't know, The Heart of Darkness was a book written by Joseph Conrad, published in 1902, about a journey up the Congo River, which touches on themes of civilization, imperialism, and racism, and as its name implies, this isn't a pleasant story, but more akin to a realization of horrors committed by the so-called civilizers of the world. This is an extremely heavy theme, and while not every aspect of the book is touched upon in the plot, there are clear homages to the story, and it was an obvious inspiration in the message they wanted to get across of the horrors of conflict and bloodshed. If that jump alone was as mature as the themes in the Far Cry franchise got, and the third game went back to boobs and bullets, then I still would have respected the hell out of the franchise. But they step it up even further in Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3 doesn't just have a thematic message to deliver through its plot, but it also takes the next step and focuses in on character development. This is something Far Cry 2 didn't really focus on. In fact, the player can choose between several different characters of different backgrounds at the start, which don't affect the plot at all. Far Cry 3 has a plot that coincides and deepens its character arc, both of which take clear inspiration from the film Apocalypse Now, which is most directly referenced in this game when the Flight of the Valkyries plays toward the end as Jason is destroying everything from a helicopter turret. For those who haven't seen Apocalypse Now, that movie is also very much about a journey into a heart of darkness where the men struggle to hold on to their sanity in the jungle of Vietnam, and itself was inspired by Heart of Darkness. In fact, they are searching for a US Army colonel who has entirely snapped and runs a rogue compound of warriors while praising the ruthless ability to kill without judgment or remorse. The story is very much about coming face to face with humanity's own primal aptitude for violence and what it means to go insane. It is a very similar story to what Jason Brody has to face in Far Cry 3, and while it isn't set in Vietnam, the lush jungle setting in the Pacific is close enough. So in that way, Far Cry 3 is yet another step up from Far Cry 2. This game goes about telling a story of the horrors of violence and war, but also tells of what that can do to a person, and in the end, the story gives the player the choice on whether to succumb or fight back. The Far Cry series shot out of the gate with 3 increasingly great entries that only improved with each release in relation to gameplay, design, and story. Far Cry 1 is a humble beginning that established the early gameplay and setting that these games would come to be known for. Far Cry 2 took things up to the next level, opening up the world to a massive scale, grounding the franchise in an air of realism, and delivering a somber message of the horrors of war. Finally, Far Cry 3 took the best elements of both its predecessors and went even beyond them, adding stealth and traversal mechanics that would become synonymous with the franchise going forward, and delivering on an epic, character-driven narrative which is both bombastically entertaining and surprisingly introspective with one of the most iconic villains in modern video game history. I thought it would be fun to look back on the first 3 games in what has become kind of an unexpected franchise staple in Ubisoft's catalog of games. But don't worry, I'll be covering the rest of the series soon. That about wraps up my thoughts on Far Cry 1, 2, and 3. They are a group of games that I think are a little underrated. I think Far Cry 2 doesn't get nearly the credit it deserves, and Far Cry 1 was surprisingly fun in a different kind of way. And everyone already knows that Far Cry 3 rips. So what are your thoughts on Far Cry as a series? Which of the original 3 games is your favorite? Let me know this and whatever else you want in the comments below. And if you liked this video, please like this video.